Good morning. I have the really difficult task of following Holly, so apologies for my performance. So this talk is on the state of OT cyber attacks and traversing level 3.5, the artist formerly known as Airgap. I was kind of hoping there was some kind of pride for the longest title, but don't worry about it. Operational technology is niche, but this talk is very accessible. It doesn't really follow any sort of technical research. It's kind of more attempting to provoke some sort of discussion. So I'm Rick. I'm going to be giving you some hot takes throughout this, so I'm going to prove some credentials about me. I like motorbiking. I like traveling on motorbikes. Unfortunately, it's a very expensive and time-consuming hobby, so I don't get to do it much. So my other hobby is hoarding cats. These are our three on the slide. I'll shamelessly say my favorite is the top one because of a great taste in literature. But it's a bit unfair, the other two can't read. More seriously, kind of like Stuart said, I've unfortunately been in cybersecurity for a long time, predominantly as a consultant, penetration tester, and that kind of thing. But I recently completed a PhD, which essentially means I wrote a really specific and boring book. Mine was on quantifying cyber risk. The picture on the left-hand side of the slide is Lancaster's Industrial Control System or Operational Technology Lab, which is where I cut my teeth, where I learned everything. And although my PhD wasn't about operational technology, the collaborative environment there is fantastic. And I managed to get involved in lots of fun research, including the re-implementation and design of the lab, and also some really cool stuff about offensive techniques for improving reconnaissance and enumeration and attacking and C2 within these kind of environments, which kind of led me to do a Black Hat talk, which was super exciting, especially for a PhD student doing very academic kind of stuff. More recently than that, I spent the best part of a year as an OT cybersecurity consultant, working mainly in power generation, transmission, and distribution. So I've seen this kind of thing for quite some time. But recently, I couldn't stay away from research, so I've moved over to Orange as a senior security researcher. And I'm focusing again on operational technology, and I'm having a great time doing it because this is literally my job. So we have to talk about operational technology. I'm going to go on a limb and assume everyone knows about IT here, at least in some sort of capacity. So I'm not going to have a primer on IT. But for OT devices, there are three main ones that I'm going to be talking about throughout this talk. On the left-hand side, we have a programmable logic controller, which is essentially the heart of an operational technology environment. So this is the thing that will be listening and sensing from the physical world, and then according to its programming, actuating pumps, sensors, that kind of thing. Moving over, we've got the human-machine interface, which is kind of like the first interface that an engineer will be seeing. It's basically taking the data directly from the PLC, and basically you can kind of actuate pumps and stuff manually there. These are usually quite localized on site. And then we finally have the remote telemetry or remote terminal unit. Either one seems to be applicable. I literally don't know which one is which anymore. But these, they've kind of crossed over with programmable logic controllers where PLCs now do a little bit of the kind of networking, but these used to be the ones that did the networking. So as you can tell from the state of what they look like, we just had a really good talk on the future of things from Holly. I'm talking about things from 30 years ago. So when we talk about this kind of environment, this OT environment, we tend to think of critical national infrastructure, power plants, water treatment facilities, and that kind of thing. However, there is another sector that uses operational technology quite prolifically, and that's manufacturing. And at Orange, our data says that the manufacturing sector ranks highest for both incidents and cyber extortion cases, so things like ransomware, double extortion, and that kind of thing. Which is interesting, because if manufacturing prolifically uses operational technology, and it's the highest hit sector, why we're not seeing that many deliberately targeted OT cyber attacks. So on the left-hand side, we've got a timeline from 1988 to 2020, which is when the paper that I took this from was published, so there's nothing after that. There were a few. Of operational technology attacks that the researchers could actually find. And what you'll notice is there's only a handful. There aren't really that many. Which, when you compare it to IT cybersecurity attacks, we're experiencing like tens, if not hundreds of thousands a year. So there is a stark difference between those two. And the reason I'm saying this, that we aren't seeing that many, is when these OT attacks do happen, they are very typically newsworthy. So even as late as last year, we saw Predatory Sparrow attack Iranian steel mills. We saw the cyber extortion group Clot get access to the OT environment of South Staffordshire Water, not too far from here. And even if you look at attacks like Stuxnet, I had to say it, it's an OT talk, that happened 13 years ago, and we're still obsessed with it because these attacks are so infrequent that 13 years ago is still relevant somehow. I mean, then again, 13 years ago on the scale of these OT vulnerabilities that still exist from 30 years ago is all right. So we're also experiencing the OT but not OT attack dilemma. And all these quotes that you see on the slide right now are from the same report, which is Kaspersky's 2022 roundup of industrial control systems, or OT, cybersecurity incidents. And I'm going to kind of summarize this so you don't have to read them all. What you will notice is that a lot of these quotes, or all of these quotes at least, or a lot of the actual attacks, the OT wasn't targeted and it was barely affected. In a number of cases, it wasn't affected at all. And in most cases where it was affected, it was as collateral damage, or the OT was disconnected or shut down as precaution during an IT incident. So these kind of things are labeled as OT attacks, but they aren't. And if you look on the bottom left of the slide, what we have is a screenshot from GhostSec, who purportedly managed to do some sort of ransomware-style encryption on an RTU. Do you remember I said remote terminal telemetry unit before? So it's supposedly an OT device, but when people actually dug into this remotely at all, everyone realized straight away that this isn't an OT device. This is an IT router that can speak a few protocols. So even these hacktivist groups, although scary that they are trying to show some power and show some capability in this area, they're not really doing it right. So I want to just quickly go over the approximate anatomy of an OT organization before we go any further, just so I can describe a few things a little bit better. What we have on the left-hand side of the slide is the Purdue Enterprise Reference Architecture, or Purdue model. And it kind of just very loosely describes how an organization that utilizes operational technology would lay everything out in terms of what technology they use in IT and OT. It does say the manufacturing zone, but this does apply to any kind of organization that uses operational technology. Now, at the top, we have the enterprise zone, the IT zone. This is essentially kind of the IT infrastructure that everyone here should probably be familiar with. These are kind of devices that you can go in, you can slam your nmaps, your Nessuses around, and they are typically very resilient to that kind of thing. You don't really have to worry. You can use all your typical tools and techniques and everything like that, and it's fine. But when we get down to the manufacturing zone, or OT area, we start to get assets that are very bespoke, and they fall over under the smallest of circumstances. For example, if you send an nmap, a generic nmap, to a Siemens PLC, it will think that port 102, which is their F7 comms protocol, is RDP. So it'll go, oh, I'll test that for RDP, instantly breaks it. So you have to be much more careful. You can't just start slamming around your IT security techniques in this kind of area. This is built into levels. So we've got levels 0 through to 3 in this area. So level 0, the process, is where the sensors, the pumps, the actuators, and that kind of thing are. And that then feeds up to level 1, which is where we have our PLCs, which is basic control. So this will sense everything that's going on, and it will actuate the pumps according to its programming, whatever. Up to level 2, we'll have those HMIs, those human-machine interfaces, typically just basically kind of like taking the information and presenting it in a nice way so that you can maybe do something manually and that kind of thing. And then finally, we get up to level 3, which is the manufacturing and operations control, which it might be on-site in an organization that is quite geographically dispersed, like power transmission, water treatment, for example. You might find that these are in a kind of centralized location, like you may see like a SOC or a NOC or something like that. And this is where you've heard of supervisory control and data acquisition, SCADA. This is kind of the amalgamation of that data in one central point. And then between those two things that I've just spoken about, we have the demilitarized zone, or level 3.5 between levels 3 and 4, the artist formerly known as Airgap. And the whole point here is it kind of very typical of the entire OT security paradigm, which is just separate everything, put firewalls in place, and just don't let anything get anywhere. Because we want to not only keep bad guys out, but even just like random bits of traffic that could go and then just knock a PLC off. Because just one thing could have a cascading issue. And then we have one PLC that goes offline in one power transmission site, and then the entire UK is then knocked off from a cascade, and then we have lots of problems. So that kind of gets onto the point that OT really does just focus on that perimeter, and it's just keeping people out. There is obviously the idea of keeping defense in depth, but these environments, they can't just be shut down and patched. You can't just like go, oh, we'll just patch an engineering workstation that we use to configure a PLC, because they need to keep running at all times, especially in critical national infrastructure. And some of these environments, they will only have a specific shutdown period, maybe once every 5 or even 10 or more years. So when you hear this trope that, oh, operational technology is out of date, it needs patching, it's got vulnerabilities, like, people know that, like, they're very acutely aware of that. It's not the case that this is a choice or this is ignorance. This is straight up, you just can't do it. So this is why we focus on keeping bad guys or generally anyone that you don't want out of your operational technology. And going a little bit further, if we start looking at the more prominent kind of standards and guidelines like IEC 62443, we then go in a little bit more detail into things like zones and conduits and really separating things out and really putting things into categories. So that's kind of how we're laid out. But why aren't we seeing these attacks targeting OT if we're basically focusing on a perimeter, which demonstrably in IT over the past 30 years hasn't worked that well? So going back to when I said that maybe it's a case that we're not seeing OT attacks because they're not reported, maybe it is just a case that they're not interesting and there is a lack of reporting. I kind of doubt that when we see things like steel mills just going nuts. Maybe because of the OT but not OT attack dilemma, it's kind of creating a journalistic boy who cried wolf culture, whereby we've had journalists that have reported things to be OT attacks that have days or hours later been found out to actually be basically an IT attack that has had collateral damage or just simply an engineering issue. It might be the case that adversaries just aren't interested. I referenced before the South Staffordshire water attack by the ransomware or cyber extortion group Club. They had access to the human-machine interface, which means they were deep into the physical environment. They could have done what they wanted. They had the option to play around with things there, but they deliberately didn't. And they even released a statement saying they don't attack critical infrastructure or health organizations. So it could be a case that they have some sort of conscience. I doubt that. It could be a case that they don't want the attention. They don't want to potentially impact human lives because of that's a bit different in terms of authorities coming after you than stealing some money. It could also be a case that no one's really figured out how to monetize this kind of environment yet. And the predominant attacks we see are financially motivated. So maybe it's just the case that no one has really worked out how to actually get money from attacking operational technology in the same way that you can get money from doing cyber extortion. It could be the case that they don't have the capability. Now, this is a niche area, and getting into it is, there are barriers to entry. There's the cost of actually being able to get access to the actual technology itself to play around with it. So maybe it's just that there's no capability. However, if they even do have the capability, there are then still barriers for the adversaries that actually know what they're doing. In an unfamiliar environment, getting from the top left of the slide, where you've got a foothold in an OT environment, to the bottom left of the slide, where we have access to HMIs, we can exfiltrate piping and instrumentation diagrams. To the right-hand side of the slide, where we're actually starting to write exploit code for very bespoke environments. It requires an additional tactic called process comprehension. Because we can't just look at the actual network and we can't just like scan for ports and find out what's going on. It's much deeper than that. The PLCs have underlying code that actually work in the physical environment that affect that kind of thing. And you have to really understand that. And this can even involve physical infiltration of the environment that you want to attack to actually really understand what's going on. Because you don't know what the PLC is doing. You don't know whether it's attached to what sensors, what kind of pumps, maybe a robot or some sort. And then what are those pumps and what are those valves connected to? Is it a big water tank? Is it something that's holding gas? You don't know. So kind of getting that information to be able to cause some sort of deliberate physical impact is extremely difficult. That's why we really only see it from state-level actors to do these really highly complex and precise attacks. And finally, going on to why we might not be seeing these attacks, and I think this might be the least likely of all of them, but I'll let you decide for yourself. It might be the case that this perimeter, that this notion of demilitarized zone or level 3.5 is actually working and it's keeping bad guys out. I don't really quite believe that because we aren't seeing people doing attacks deliberately on operational technology, but we are certainly seeing them get to the operational technology. And even at that point, we're starting to see the emergence of the industrial Internet of Things and Industry 4.0 and whatever buzzwords that you may hear that basically connect things like PLCs, HMIs, RTUs directly to the Internet and completely forgo this whole idea of a perimeter. And I think we can all kind of have an idea of what happens at that point. So why and how might operational technology actually become a target? The first thing is these environments have very mature metrics, so they know almost down to the minute how much money they're losing by not being operational. And they'll also be very acutely aware of if they actually have to halt the process while it's actually going, what kind of things will be spoiled and what kind of things, how much money that will cost. So there is definitely a way of the adversary being able to monetize this because the victims will know exactly how much it's going to cost and they'll know exactly how much they're willing to pay for a certain amount of downtime. It's way more tangible than, say, for example, encrypting some data or leaking some data, which is kind of a little bit more nebulous. You don't always know the exact value of that. But this you can literally quantify directly. What's more is the barriers to entry for getting into this are lowering. Like IoT cybersecurity knowledge is becoming more pervasive. Just the fact that I'm doing this talk, for example. Research into this area. I mentioned that I got involved with some research before while I was at the university full time. And what we did was we essentially were able to extract the binary that is running directly in a PLC's memory, take that, parse it, and understand exactly what it's doing, which vastly made easier process comprehension, the tactic that I was telling you about before, which then, in turn, makes OT attacks far more accessible. We then don't have to necessarily physically infiltrate the environment. We can know what's going on from basically a distance. Other research involves digital twins. So one of the other things that I mentioned was that there is a financial cost, not only to getting into this area, but to doing the attack. It's widely speculated that the more precise and complex attacks, such as Stuxnet, the adversaries will have re-implemented the physical environment to develop and test their attacks. And with the emergence of digital twins and more capable simulation, we can basically rely on these things rather than having to buy costly devices to basically do this. And we don't have to rely on engineers that are wiring everything together to kind of make sure that we have a good re-implementation. The dissemination of knowledge, as an example, like I said before, is me doing this talk, but there are literal conferences dedicated to this. So there's S4, which happens over in the US, which is a massive conference entirely dedicated to this kind of thing. DEF CON and a number of other conferences have had the ICS village running for years now. So people are exposed to this in conferences all the time. There are academic courses about this kind of thing. There are online courses like on Udemy and things like that are about operational technology. And also you can just see a plethora of videos on YouTube. Like you can literally just go and check out, how do I break into an OT environment on YouTube nowadays. Unfortunately, it's becoming more prevalent. And the kind of the last thing why I think this is going to be more prevalent in the coming years is that More recently, when we've seen these attacks happening from the high-level kind of state-sponsored actors, we're seeing malware and attack frameworks that are specifically dedicated to operational technology now. And it's not just like one kind of like one fire and forget like bespoke exploit. It's the case that these adversaries are prepared. They have a whole suite of things that they can do with one software package capability. Things like Triton, Pipedream, and Destroyers 1 and 2 are good, fairly recent examples. And if the bad guys are making these frameworks, how long is it until we start seeing commercial organizations commoditize frameworks dedicated to OT attacks? We've already seen it with things like IT attacks, like Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, and that kind of thing. So I want to leave you with one thought. IT attacks were once restricted to advanced adversaries with niche skills too. So if we really think about it, how long is it until we start seeing these kind of attacks be accessible to less advanced adversaries? And that's me. Thank you very much. And I think I've got time for questions.
Absolute legend. Has anyone got any questions? We have got a couple of minutes. Go for it. Chap at the front.
Thanks.
Yes. So most of the attacks we're seeing at the moment are kind of like nuisance attacks. You can just stop a PLC and it just takes an engineer to go, whoop, flip the switch. There are two cases, and they're only research, theoretical cases of ransomware in operational technology, and they're not very effective because while theoretically they work, you can encrypt the PLC. They didn't explain how, so that was a bit weird. But you can encrypt the PLC, but it's kind of pointless. If you encrypt an individual PLC in one of these environments, the engineers are going to go through exactly the same process as if the PLC broke. It's very similar to modern IT backups, where there's a resilience built in. They just take the PLC out, put a new one in, and reprogram it, and then the encryption it doesn't matter anymore. However, I've actually been working on a piece of research at the moment that is called Dead Man's PLC. That is a completely pragmatic and realistic way of basically extorting an entire OT environment. It's completely vendor agnostic, and it affects every OT environment in the world. So we're not releasing the code. But so that's just been submitted to an academic conference, and it'll be submitted to more wider industry conferences. So I will be doing the rounds and speaking about that. But it's really interesting. Exploits. It's purely using things that are available to the actual OT environment itself. So we only use native functionality, no exploits. So it's undetectable as well as being quite brutal. But at the moment, no. I'm living proof that there is research in the area. Rob?
I'm going to ask any more questions. If you could grab Rick, he's probably going to be you're around all day? Super. You're home, really, so
yeah.
You're going to be loitering with intent. Superb. One last round of applause for Rick. That was a